Hello everyone, this is Pastor Howie, and we're continuing our readings and thoughts from the scriptures as we come to Acts chapter 21 again, this time looking at the section in verses 27 through 36 where Paul gets arrested. Paul is arrested in Jerusalem. So he has completed his third missionary journey. His intention was to return to Jerusalem, and in his letters, this may have been also his return to Jerusalem with donations for the impoverished fellow Christians in Jerusalem. That's not stated clearly in Acts, and it may not be the same trip back to Jerusalem, but it does seem to fit. Either way, he comes back to Jerusalem. He is greeted and hosted and given hospitality by fellow Christians, but they are concerned that people will see Paul in Jerusalem and think that he has totally left Judaism behind, which in a sense he has. He is the apostle to the Gentiles of the New Covenant gospel of Jesus Christ. And wherever he went with synagogues, he very often found opposition and conflict and trouble. So he was encouraged to take some men who had entered into a ritual vow, to the temple, so that they could finish that ritual. And that's where we find the apostle. And in the last video I said Paul, I think, made an error in judgment, not a sin necessarily, but an error in judgment, and an error that would bring him to the place in this video where he gets beaten, he gets arrested, but in all of what's going on in Paul's life, God is guiding him. He is accompanying the apostle through temptation and trials, and ultimately the gospel is going to end up in the capital city of the Roman Empire. So it started in the capital city of the Jewish Old Covenant people and ends up in the capital of the Gentile nations, the capital of the Roman Empire. But in between, we see quite a bit of trouble for Paul. So let's read this section, Acts chapter 21, verses 27 through 36. Paul arrested. Verse 27, when the 7 days were nearly over, that's the 7 days of the ritual vow before these men that Paul was paying for their vow to be completed, would complete it. So when the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia, so there were still Jews coming and going to and from Jerusalem from all over the Roman Empire, and these people were from Asia. Asia being referring to not the Asia we think of, but the Asia which is at that time confined in the Roman province of what we now call Turkey, Asia Minor. Anyway, Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place," which was a lie, because they were exaggerating in their anger and their fear of the teaching of the gospel that Paul spread throughout Asia Minor, establishing churches in Asia Minor. And so they were aware of what he was doing, perhaps had heard about him. Maybe they even had heard him in one of the synagogues. But they were exaggerating, grossly exaggerating the fact that he was teaching everyone, everywhere against our people and our law in this place. He was not. He was, wherever he went, and we've read this, wherever Paul was, he continued to preach and teach from the scriptures that Jesus is the Messiah. That's what they were rebelling against. They didn't believe that Jesus Christ of Nazareth was indeed Jesus the Messiah. They rejected him, took him and tried him, condemned him to death, and then turned him over to the Romans to be crucified. And so wherever the gospel was preached, there was this opposition, this unbelief, standing as an adversary. And remember, the word Satan means adversary. So this is all of the devil. It's all of the spirit of Antichrist. But God is overruling every step of the way. And so they told this lie. They exaggerated what they knew about Paul. And besides, they go on to say, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place, which was not true. And Luke puts in parentheses in verse 29 these words. They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian. So Trophimus was a Gentile, but a believer, in the city with Paul, and assumed, in other words, they didn't witness Paul taking Trophimus with him into the temple. They assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple, end parentheses. So that just stirred everybody up. Verse 30 tells us that the whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. So this seems to be a pattern in the first century, that people had nothing better to do than to get involved in mob violence. We're kind of seeing that today. People aren't reasonable. They're not rational. And mobs just spark up. People want to know what's going on. And, I expect that had this all occurred in our day, or if somebody had gone back in time and delivered cell phones to everybody, this would all be on Facebook. But this is how they reacted. They just, they hear one thing and it's exaggerated and it's blown out of proportion, and it stirs people up. And the stirring of people up, the more people get stirred up, the more people come in to see what's going on. They get stirred up even though they don't even know what's going on. And that's what happens. That's how Luke is describing this. The whole city was aroused. Verse 31, while they were trying to kill him, so they not only got him out of the temple, but they're trying to kill him. While they're trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops, whose his mission was to maintain peace in the city of Jerusalem. The Pax Romana. The Romans didn't care what people did as long as they maintained peace, and they didn't like mob violence. They didn't like uprisings that might threaten the peace of Rome. So the Roman troops, this commander of the Roman troops, once he heard about it, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul, because everybody knew in the Roman Empire the consequences of being involved in some sort of riot. People are going to get killed if they didn't calm down. Verse 33, the commander came up and arrested Paul. Now, okay, so the Jews from Asia assumed that Paul had taken a Gentile into the temple. This caused a riot. The Roman commander assumes that Paul is the reason there's a riot, and that probably he started the riot. So he arrests Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, and some another. See, they didn't even know what was going on. So there were all kinds of different stories and versions of what was going on with the Apostle Paul. Some shouted one thing, some shouted another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" Almost like the crowd that kept shouting, crucify him," referring to Jesus when a mob was stirred up in Jerusalem prior to Christ's arrest and his trial and his crucifixion. So that's what I have for you today. It looks a lot like what's going on in our world today. And certainly we know and we see signs all around us that the spirit of Antichrist is still stirring up opposition and adversaries to the preaching of the gospel. They're unreasonable, they're not rational, they're simply the spirit of Antichrist working against the gospel. We need to understand that, but we need to stay firm and stand our ground as ambassadors for Christ in this world, no matter what happens. Consequences occur, lies get told, Christians get persecuted, not so much in America violently, but in other places around the world it goes on to this day. We need to stand firm, and we need to pray for one another and pray for our brothers and sisters in other lands and other cultures who are being persecuted. Even so come, Lord Jesus. Till next time, God bless you.